Please subscribe, like and share this content. It means a lot to us. Thank you in advance.
Cornell Law School. U.C.C. Article 9, Secured Transactions. Part 7, Transition. Paragraph 9701. Effective date. This Act takes effect on July 1, 2001. Paragraph 9702. Savings Clause. A. Pre-effective date transactions or liens. Except as otherwise provided in this part, this Act applies to a transaction or lien within its scope, even if the transaction or lien was entered into or created before this Act takes effect. B. Continuing validity. Except as otherwise provided in subsection C and sections 9703 through 9709. 1. Transactions and liens that were not governed by former Article 9 were validly entered into or created before this Act takes effect, and would be subject to this Act if they had been entered into or created after this Act takes effect, and the rights, duties, and interests flowing from those transactions and liens remain valid after this Act takes effect, and 2. The transactions and liens may be terminated, completed, consummated, and enforced as required or permitted by this Act or by the law that otherwise would apply if this Act had not taken effect. C. Pre-effective date proceedings. This Act does not affect an action, case, or proceeding commenced before this Act takes effect. Paragraph 9703. Security interest perfected before effective date. A. Continuing priority over lien creditor. Perfection requirements satisfied. A security interest that is enforceable immediately before this Act takes effect and would have priority over the rights of a person that becomes a lien creditor at that time is a perfected security interest under this Act if, when this Act takes effect, the applicable requirements for enforceability and perfection under this Act are satisfied without further action. B. Continuing priority over lien creditor. Perfection requirements not satisfied. Except as otherwise provided in Section 9705, if, immediately before this Act takes effect, a security interest is enforceable and would have priority over the rights of a person that becomes a lien creditor at that time, but the applicable requirements for enforceability or perfection under this Act are not satisfied when this Act takes effect, the security interest 1. Is a perfected security interest for 1 year after this Act takes effect. 2. Remains enforceable thereafter only if the security interest becomes enforceable under Section 9203 before the year expires, and 3. Remains perfected thereafter only if the applicable requirements for perfection under this Act are satisfied before the year expires. Paragraph 9704. Security interest unperfected before effective date. A security interest that is enforceable immediately before this Act takes effect but which would be subordinate to the rights of a person that becomes a lien creditor at that time. 1. Remains an enforceable security interest for 1 year after this Act takes effect. 2. Remains enforceable thereafter if the security interest becomes enforceable under Section 9203 when this Act takes effect or within 1 year thereafter, and 3. Becomes perfected. A. Without further action, when this Act takes effect if the applicable requirements for perfection under this Act are satisfied before or at that time, or B. When the applicable requirements for perfection are satisfied if the requirements are satisfied after that time. Paragraph 9705. Effectiveness of action taken before effective date. A. Pre-effective date action. 1 year perfection period unless re-perfected. If action, other than the filing of a financing statement, is taken before this Act takes effect and the action would have resulted in priority of a security interest over the rights of a person that becomes a lien creditor had the security interest become enforceable before this Act takes effect, the action is effective to perfect the security interest that attaches under this Act within 1 year after this Act takes effect. An attached security interest becomes unperfected 1 year after this Act takes effect unless the security interest becomes a perfected security interest under this Act before the expiration of that period. B. Pre-effective date filing. The filing of a financing statement before this Act takes effect is effective to perfect the security interest to the extent the filing would satisfy the applicable requirements for perfection under this Act. C. Pre-effective date filing in jurisdiction formally governing perfection. This act does not render ineffective an effective financing statement that, before this act takes effect, is filed and satisfies the applicable requirements for perfection under the law of the jurisdiction governing perfection as provided in former section 9103. However, except as otherwise provided in subsections D and E and section 9706, the financing statement ceases to be effective at the earlier of 1. The time the financing statement would have ceased to be effective under the law of the jurisdiction in which it is filed, or 2. June 30th, 2006. D. Continuation statement. The filing of a continuation statement after this act takes effect does not continue the effectiveness of the financing statement filed before this act takes effect. However, upon the timely filing of a continuation statement after this act takes effect and in accordance with the law of the jurisdiction governing perfection as provided in Part 3, the effectiveness of a financing statement filed in the same office in the jurisdiction before this act takes effect continues for the period provided by the law of that jurisdiction. E. Application of subsection C2 to transmitting utility financing statement. Subsection C2 applies to a financing statement that, before this act takes effect, is filed against a transmitting utility and satisfies the applicable requirements for perfection under the law of the jurisdiction governing perfection as provided in former section 9103 only to the extent that Part 3 provides that the law of a jurisdiction other than the jurisdiction in which the financing statement is filed governs perfection of a security interest in collateral covered by the financing statement. F. Application of Part 5. A financing statement that includes a financing statement filed before this act takes effect and a continuation statement filed after this act takes effect is effective only to the extent that it satisfies the requirements of Part 5 for an initial financing statement.